I'm going to hand it over to Laura Riley, who is the director of the Department of Aging. Laura and her staff, Patty Madigan, have assisted us in getting our keynote speaker this morning. And I'm so forever grateful for them for helping us put this convening together. So Laura, I think I saw that you're on, so I'm going to pass it off to you.
I am here. Can you hear me? Okay,
yep.
Very good. So good morning, everyone. I guess in Jim's metaphor, we're the proud grandparents. I'm not really sure, but we'll figure that out. And I do have to say, Mark, I love my job. And people who work with me know that I also have on my wall, on my coffee mug, and I often say, do what you love and love what you do. And, you know, if I tell staff, if you're not loving what you do, let's talk. Let's figure this out. But we at Baltimore County Department of Aging are very fortunate to be the local senior community service employment program under the guidance of Patty Madigan and Dana Brown, our deputy. And we get to work with Gary Officer on a regular basis and his organization, which provides our oversight. So I want to, Gary, if you'll indulge me, I think it's important that we hit key points on Gary's bio, because it shows you how he's gotten to where he is today in workforce development. So since 2017, Gary Officer has been the president and CEO of the Center for Workforce Inclusion. It was funded in 1962, and it's the only organization in the country devoted solely to helping older adults qualify for, apply, and obtain gainful, meaningful employment in both the public and private sectors. Prior to coming to the center, Mr. Officer was a senior executive at the museum and the Woodrow Wilson Center for International Scholars in Washington, D.C. From 2006 to 2013, he served as president and chief executive officer of Rebuilding Together Incorporated. He also previously led the Associated Black Charities, a Baltimore-based philanthropic organization. Mr. Officer has served as president of the National Credit Union Foundation, the national foundation supporting credit union development in the United States. Prior to joining that organization, Mr. Officer worked as a leader in the affordable housing sector in the United States. He served as president and CEO of the Metropolitan Boston Housing Partnership and as director of asset management at Lakefront SRO Corporation in Chicago. So you can see where it all intertwines in ultimately helping individuals have a better quality of life. Mr. Officer earned a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from the Manchester Metropolitan University of England in 1988 and a Master of Science, International Relations from the London School of Economics in 1990. In 2012, Officer also completed the Advanced Management and Leadership program at the said business school at Oxford University. So if you can't tell, when he does speak, he's going to have a bit of an accent. And he comes to us educated in London or in England, but obviously very much rooted in the services here in our country. Gary, it's been wonderful working with you. We've seen our program grow and expand. And interestingly enough, through the marriage that we talked about, our grandparents were taught over the summer by the children in the summer youth employment program for how to use computers. So, you know, it all comes together. And I'm sure that Gary's talk will include that. But without further ado, I want to turn it over. And Gary, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura, and good morning. Thank you, Michael Lawrence, too, because he is a very persistent man. Those emails came in and they kept coming in, and I could not say no. I also want to recognize my wonderful friend, Patty Madigan, from the Baltimore County Department of Aging. When Patty calls me, I have to listen. When Patty requests that I do something, I have to accept. She's a great friend and a great credit to the county, and you're so lucky to have her. When I was asked to do this presentation this morning, I must confess I was somewhat nervous because, as Laura had mentioned, I'm not really a workforce development guy. Right? I build houses. I've supported banks in local communities. I've led grassroots advocacy efforts around the country on issues that affect the daily lives of marginalized groups. So I'm not really a workforce expert. You guys are. What I bring, however, is a perspective informed by different experience along my journey that I've used in this platform to advance workforce development outcomes for older Americans primarily. So I'm here to learn as much from you as perhaps you will from me. One of the things I learned when I came on board 4 years ago, again informed by my other experiences, was how powerful, how creative our nation's workforce development system really is. What I also learned very quickly, that we were our own biggest secret, because outside of the workforce development community, no one knows what you guys are doing. I run an organization that's was the largest single grantee of the federal government under the federal Senior Community Service and Employment Program. Before I got here, I'd never heard of it. I've heard of the AmeriCorps program. I've heard of Vista. I've never heard of CSEP. And the CSEP program for me is one of the gold standard programs of our nation's Great Society era movement. Never heard of it. That has to change. So what am I going to talk about today? Well, a couple of things. First, I want to share what my week has been like and how that informs this conversation. I want to talk about the ecosystem of workforce development programming around the country, what makes your network so vital. And most importantly, I want to talk about aging and what it means to build an equitable economy, an equitable workforce in light of the changing nature of work and the age dependency of our workforce that will realize itself in 2024, when older Americans will become the single largest segment of the US workforce. By 2024, older Americans will become the oldest single segment of the US workforce. And what are we going to do about that? How will we prepare our older workers for a workforce they haven't seen, and an economy that's going to need them? So this week I did a couple of things that were noteworthy. One, I was asked to participate on a PBS panel about the future of work. It was sponsored by PBS, Working Nation, and AARP. On the panel was Paul Irvine, chairman of the Milken Institute for the Center of Aging, the leadership from Cheryl, Society for Human Resources Management, senior VP from AARP, a lady from Boston who invests privately in programming around the country.
Wait 1 second. Let me turn.
Hold on. Yeah, if everyone could please mute themselves. Please mute yourself.
Thank you. So the recording started with a video of a man named Chris. Chris was living in his RV because Chris lost everything during the Great Recession. He had a job that promised a retirement. He had health care that he knew he would get. He had a house that had a mortgage, and his family was secure. But as a result of the Great Recession, he lost practically everything. And Chris is now living in an RV, traveling around Oregon, performing in interim jobs running RV parks at half the salary he was on 15 years ago. And there's a Chris in every single community. So Chris's story started the program. We were then asked as a panel, what gives you optimism about the state of aging and workforce development? And all these experts began to talk glowingly about what employers are doing and by making commitments to training and all kinds of things that signals a change. When it came to me, the question was posed, what gives you optimism? I said in Canada, nothing. I've heard nothing about Chris's story and the responses to his issues, his dreams, his goals, his losses, that I can say with confidence fills me with hope. Because my pessimism is this, and Laura signaled this. I was not born in the US. I was born in Great Britain. I've traveled many countries. Our exceptionalism runs very deep in the United States. COVID-19 gave us all an opportunity to stop, to pause, and to reflect. COVID-19 forced many countries, many democracies to ask questions of itself, to ask questions about who are we? What's our purpose? How should we treat citizens who are in need? And how does our treatment of them speak to our national character and our values? In many ways, COVID-19 ought to have forced us to re-examine our compact between labor and business. Because we are at a tipping point in this country. We could either go backwards, which clearly didn't work, or we can go forward. But we have to completely transform the relationship between employers and their employees if we are to use the COVID pandemic as a starting point for a different way of thinking, a different way of doing business, and a different way of creating solutions to the challenges of exclusion in our society. What is clear to me over the last couple of weeks, and ought to be clear to many of you, is the markets. And the markets, I'm referring to the behavior of ordinary citizenry, has already given us a signal. Labor force participation rate in this country right now is 61%. It's almost at an all-time low. People are refusing to take jobs. Do you know why? They have had enough. Enough of employers who are not willing to be flexible. Enough to opt out because of healthcare need, a childcare need, an elder parent need that only requires one basic response: understanding and flexibility. That's not who we are. That's not who we are. And people are opting out because of that. Do you know that Pete Buttigieg requested or took 4 weeks off paternity leave for his newborn son? And there was a quiet little public debate about whether or not, or how dare he do that. Boris Johnson in the UK took 6 weeks off paternity leave as the Prime Minister 18 months ago. There was no debate. In fact, people applauded him. So when your political leaders are setting the standard and citizenry say, we agree, good job, Boris, take it, enjoy your family, he's sending a signal to the marketplace, to employers, that this is how I want people to be treated, because I'm taking the time off. And therefore, if my employees are taking time off, allow them. But in this country, Pete Buttigieg, our transportation secretary, was criticized for 4 weeks. That's what I'm talking about. And ordinary people have made a decision to opt out because all they want is fairness and understanding. Also this week, I had a national town hall meeting that I had with 20 national organizations, and I moderated a discussion with the Labor Secretary, Marty Walsh. And I've known the secretary for a long time, so this was an easy interview. And what was very clear to me in his storytelling, his understanding of all things labor, that for the first time in a long, long time, we have a labor secretary who really understands workforce development. That's good for all of us. And he's extremely supportive of the WIOA program. Baltimore County and the region you guys represent, for me, represents something that is essential, an essential fabric of our nation. It represents work. We know also that in your county, older residents and those in marginalized communities have lived through, over the last 3 or 4 decades, for some people, a multi-generational nightmare in the workforce. Disappearance of work. But I also know this, that as someone who is born not in the United States, the greatest gifts of our nation is grassroots advocacy, grassroots linkages, grassroots relationships, all in the pursuit of change, all in the pursuit of solving our most intractable problems in localized communities. And my friends, that is really you guys. I pinged Secretary Walsh on several questions by citing examples to him about workforce development programs in Boston, and whether or not what he was saying would apply to these 2 or 3 groups that he and I share a common interest in. And what he told me was pretty unique. It was quite affirming. What the secretary said was what has worked in Boston historically and the local linkages that you and I know about in Boston is not applicable and may not be applicable to other parts of the country. When I talk to workforce development groups in Cleveland, what's clear to me is that the agenda around workforce development and training is being driven out of the community colleges. It was clear to me in other cities, it's not the community college or the workforce investment boards, it's the Chamber of Commerce. So within each community, there are different local mixes that informs the outcomes. And on today's call, we have folks from a multi-sector ecosystem, all of whom are bounded by a common goal. How can we get our local citizens who are needing our resources back into the workforce through our programs based on the legislative intent, so we can create a society and local economy that provides opportunity for all? Patty kept telling me, Gary, talk about CSEP. I can. We've been involved in Baltimore County area for God knows 20, 30 years. Invested millions of dollars into the CSEP program. But I told Patty, and I told my staff, this conversation is not about CSEP. We're not a marginalized group seeking pity. I've traveled the country and spoken to recently graduated PhDs at 55 years old who can't find work. My CSEP director on Cape Cod is a former Harvard PhD adjunct professor, can't find work. My CSEP participant in Charlotte has a BSN, has a back injury, moved down with her partner, can't find work. This is not about CSEP. This is about workforce inclusion. This is about seeing in a person not their age, but their talent, their wisdom, their training, their ability to work in teams, and how that informs our corporate or institutional outcomes. I read something the other day that said that up to 70% of older workers are screened out of the application process by algorithms. 70% of older workers are screened out of the application process because of algorithms. That because we are continuing to not fully engage our workforce, older workforce, it costs our GDP 11%. Because a fully employed older workforce contributes an extra 11% to GDP. And by the year 2050, a fully engaged older workforce will contribute 18% towards GDP. And those stats came from the Commonwealth Fund out of Massachusetts. We also know that pre-COVID, 2% of jobs that were out there allowed for remote or stay-at-home options. Today, 53% of job seekers are looking. 53% of job seekers are looking for work that allows them to stay home. The marketplace is shifting because job seekers are saying, this is the future of work we want to see. And what COVID-19 again has accelerated in almost split second. It's moved us into the workforce, into the future of work in a split second. Because 2 years ago, I would be sitting behind a screen talking to you. We would have canceled the conference and soon had a chance to do it live. Now we're all doing Zoom. So the future of work is here and now, and we have a workforce ready to be fully engaged. So what makes Baltimore County unique? You guys are a region that has over 400,000 employees. You have 21,000 businesses. Yet you have a concentration of employment in a very small group of 20 occupational categories through a very small number of employers. Manufacturing, research, the federal government, healthcare, utilities, education, and financial services. That is the segment that represents the largest employer base in the region. So what is abundantly clear to me this morning is that the majority of the county's workforce are actually employed by small and mid-sized businesses. It's not the hospitals, it's not Lockheed. It's not Baltimore County. It's small and mid-sized businesses, most of which employ over 100 people. So the linkages we may have to begin to formulate is how can we prepare people for occupations, opportunities within the workforce segment that represents the largest cluster of opportunities in the county. How do we engage the regional chambers of commerce, elected officials, perhaps even faith-based groups, to make the call that coming out of COVID, we have to find ways of doing things differently. And our historical local linkages is not one that's premised on a network only of training organizations with partners, of course, but a wider net of institutions for which we can depend on to pave the way for folks to get back into the workforce. And what was clear to me in speaking with the secretary was that workforce strategies, successful ones, are essentially local. I also saw a commitment to technological and digital training around the workforce and the jobs for the future. Let's begin to prepare people through technology platforms to increase their proficiency so that employers will accept them where they are. And the other thing to note about technology, which I think is important for all of us to recognize, myself included, is that there is minimal to zero drop-off among older workers when it comes to their technological proficiency if they remain in the workforce. The challenge occurs when they leave the workforce. When they leave the workforce, technology moves ahead of them. So we have to make the case that because folks are of a certain age, it doesn't mean that they lack the necessary proficiency to function with confidence and competency within a workforce where those requirements will now become the norm. The secretary also talked about broadband access, because you go out into the outer realm of your county, you probably have issues around broadband coverage. My mother worked at Walmart as a greeter for 18 years in Florida. When she applied for her job at Walmart, she walked into the store and filled out an application form. Now you can't do that anymore. You're going to go online and apply and hope they call you back. So even the most basic of jobs requires access to a computer. And we know how to use one to apply and perhaps to perform. So he also talked about the expansion of the broadband access to support folks that are going to be served by his agency. And WIOA, what was very clear to me again was the WIOA programs that are funded through this administration within the Build Back Better platform is something that is going to receive tremendous support during the life of this administration. And for him, certification, as well as industry recognized credentials, are going to be key. And what was fundamentally clear, which might have come through in the voting patterns during the last presidential election, was that this president is committed to invest in federal resources in addressing the latent needs of marginalized groups. And he considers older workers a marginalized population. So Build Back Better for him is going to be a central theme that runs through the Biden presidency. So what's my prediction for the next 2 or 3 years? And I think my colleague from the Maryland Department of Aging, James, is sitting there. I'm hoping he's going to nod his head on this. I predict that for the next 18 months to the midterms, and we've seen this with the debate in Washington around the infrastructure and spending bill, that this president will try and get as much of his presidential priorities in place before the midterms. So the spending tap will be turned off or modified after the 2022 midterms. Because now we're going to return to gridlock. So 2022 is a period of time when we'll see a stop. And most of the funds that are coming through, including the CSEP, by the way, CSEP has a $35 million 3-year increase locked into the reconciliation bill. So he's building in 3 or 4 years out. So the next 2 years is important. We are also going to see in the public realm another important touch point. In 2024, older Americans will become the single largest segment of the US workforce. You will see more articles, more blogs, more interviews. You see all that stuff. But the American public will become a lot more aware of where our workforce demographic trends are headed, who we are going to depend on, and ultimately the marketplace will react. So I'm working with the convergence of 2022 and 2024 to drive the agenda here at the Center for Workforce Inclusion. Where do I see hope? I think hope can be found, and I'm speaking to a government audience today, but I'll say this with respect. In cities in the US where I have lived, local philanthropy have played a huge role in bringing additional private resources into the workforce system. The Boston Private Investment Corporation, I would assume maybe 35% of their budget comes from State Street, Bank of America, the Community Foundation, you name it. In Baltimore County, in Baltimore City, you are home to almost $11 billion in private philanthropy dollars. From the Weinberg Foundation to the Annie E. Casey Foundation, I can name all of them. And one of the things I have often said around here with disappointment is how little, in compared to other cities, I'm seeing the big foundations really invest in their city. Most of Annie E. Casey's funding flows out of the country, out of the city. Weinberg puts their names on buildings. Philanthropy spends less than 2% of their grant making on aging and less than 1% of their grant making on workforce development. Neil Sullivan in Boston, who runs the Boston PIC, it's now called something else, he's seen as a national genius because he gets private funding. But he gets private funding because the advocacy community went together as a group and sat down with leadership and said, we must do more. And we can do better. And we cannot depend on government all the time when their resources are scarce. So innovation often comes through grassroots advocacy and grassroots movement building. The reason why Bill Gates started his foundation, God knows, 25 years ago, another story, is the Boston Globe ran a series of articles. Who is this rich kid out of Seattle who went to Harvard, who's now a billionaire, that's given nothing back to the community? I lived in Boston when it happened. The op-eds were flying everywhere. And it forced Bill Gates into creating and launching this foundation. I was in Baltimore recently, and someone said that the owner of the Baltimore Ravens had committed $4.2 million to the Ozzie Newsome scholarship fund. What a great guy he was. I don't live in Baltimore County. I can say this. I said, okay, what's his net worth? He's worth $4.8 billion. So he's given $2.5 million to the Ozzie Newsome scholarship fund with a net worth of $4.8 billion. He should be ashamed of himself. Who is going to call this guy out? Guess what? Nobody. They were clapping 2.8, not his net worth of $4.8 billion. That's the issue. That's the issue. And we have to have a holistic view of our city, a holistic view of our needs. We have to sit people down and talk about what it's like for this 55-year-old gentleman who lost his job 20 years ago, lost his retirement, now raising his grandchildren, can barely pay his rent, and all he needs is an opportunity. We have to do that because we are the only voice he has. So we have to stop celebrating pittance and start putting people in check. Because our community needs us. And philanthropy has a role to play. And Baltimore City and Baltimore County can do a lot better. Because I know that. You should be a Boston. You should be a Pittsburgh. And we have to make it happen. Thank you all very much.
Wow. All I'm going to say is that was amazing. Gary, I just want to thank you for taking the time. You've really given us a lot to think about. We can be better. We can do better. We love our jobs, but we need to be better. So, I want to, you were amazing. I can't say enough. I'm seeing a lot of information in the chats. Fantastic, amazing. I did want to ask if there's two questions, or maybe if anybody has like one or two questions they want to ask Mr. Officer before we move on. But
all I would say is blame Michael and blame Patty.
Okay, so Patty and Mike Lawrence, yeah, we'll talk to you later. But you were really spoke very candidly, and I appreciate that. We're all embedded in Baltimore County, doing the work day to day, and sometimes it does get difficult to see through the fog. And you pretty much laid it out there, and I appreciate and respect that very much.
And please feel free to fact check me on the philanthropy stuff, because it's true. I study this stuff. And fact check me on your Ravens owner and his little giveaway that generated much hand clapping, but relative to his net worth, it was pittance, it was tip money. And a city should be offended that someone of that kind of power and that kind of wealth couldn't do more.
So I want to just see if anybody has, wants to speak up. I don't have to do all the speaking. So if anybody has a question they want to ask Mr. Officer or a comment, we have a few minutes. So I'd really, I want to open the floor.
If you don't mind, I wanted to comment. Thank you for sharing your passion. My name is Carlos. I work with the Department of Economic and Workforce Development. And I think you touched on a lot of very important and urgent topics. But in particular, I think, one of the things that I think you and I may be able to see differently, maybe from a cultural standpoint in the United States, the way that we look at people who are wealthy or perceived to be successful kind of get treated on a separate, they live in a separate world. I think that there are laws in place and systems in place that allow them to navigate within certain gray areas. And I mean, I think that, you need to address that. I think I work in workforce development. I don't necessarily think that there is a worker shortage. I think that there might be more that captains of industry and then leaders of industry can be doing more to incentivize work. In my mind, pay people better. And, I think that is something that's huge. I think that it's going to be a very difficult and uphill battle to, I mean, yeah, I agree with you. People should do more. If I make this much more, if I am someone who's worth billions of dollars, I don't know what I'm ever going to do with that many zeros. If you've ever visualized what a billion looks like, it's like a billion grains of rice compared to even a million grains of rice. It's ridiculous.
So if I can say this, I think people are looking for lives. People want to live a life of purpose. That's what COVID did. So I spent the lockdown watching the BBC, Sky, the Canadian stuff, to see how the debate about this lockdown was unfolded. I'm watching this debate across the country in parliaments where they're talking about values and who are we, and let's clap for the National Health Service. They are our biggest prize. This is what you call socialized medicine. An entire country was clapping and acknowledging every Thursday that the jewel in their crown is not a football team. It's not the monarchy. The jewel in the crown for the country of my birth was the health service. At the same time, we could not promise at the time giving people free access to COVID testing. Right? And out of the COVID pandemic, we, all of us, myself included, really began to think about our own purpose. What kind of life are we leading? What's our priorities? What isn't important anymore? What new connections should we be making with each other? And prospective drug seekers or people who went through that process said, you know what? When this is over, I want to change my life. The 1.8 million women, 1.8 million women who've left the workforce because of COVID, reassess their priorities. Some blog sphere will say they're lazy, folks don't want to work, and all these jobs are there, these poor people don't want to work. 1.8 million women have said, my life has purpose, my life has meaning, I have a family, I have young children, or I have older parents. I need my time. And I need an employer who's going to understand me. And in many ways, the labor shortage we're seeing, this sounds very, very European, but I'll say it anyway, we're seeing a workers' revolution. People are making choices. They're not being forced out of the workforce. They're opting out. Carlos, thank you for the question. I'll take some more. I'm enjoying this.
Thank you so much. I did want to recognize that we have a few of our board members on here that do not work for Baltimore County government, and I'm so grateful that they were able to participate. So if any of the board members that are on the call, this is your meeting too. So you were invited because, this is what we do, and we need you. So if any of the businesses that are on the call want to speak up, don't hesitate.
Hi, this is Sally Bardis. Hi, Mary. Hi, Gary. Thanks for having me on. I'm a new board member and happy to be here. I work at Stanley Black & Decker, and I just, so much of what you said, Gary, has resonated as we think about how we're continuing to make changes for the current and future of work, from really anything from hybrid, but really we are seeing that great resignation, right? I think most companies are starting to see that. And it's a candidate market. It's no longer an employer market. People have choices, and to your point, they can work anywhere across the country and not have to relocate. And that is creating opportunities for people, but it also, as an employer, we have to think about how we change our environment, and how do we shape an environment that allows many different people to thrive and give them grace, because everyone is going through something. And even being in a virtual environment for a lot of our office workers, it has been really interesting where, I hate to say this, but hashtag COVID win, where we are getting a little glimpse of people's lives.
Yeah.
It's allowing leaders to give people a little bit more flexibility because you see more of somebody. And I think that's just the nature of how we're working. And then from a frontline perspective, a lot of our manufacturing, I will say, we've had to really start to look at so many different changes as it relates to how they experience work, and what they're going through, because their needs are very different than, say, someone that's sitting at home.
Yes. How has COVID changed your approach to work?
As a mother of two, and supporting our CHRO, so being in a role that can be demanding at times, but also very rewarding. I'm lucky enough to have people around me that support me and that understand the flexibility that's needed. But for me, I think I've learned to say no, and it's okay to be honest and ask for your non-negotiables. Would I have done that maybe earlier on in my career? I don't know if I would have felt that, right? I don't know if I would have felt comfortable doing that. I think part of it is the role that you're in and the space that you have to make those adjustments. But for me, it has allowed me to slow down a little bit.
Terrific. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, we're kind of on a timeline, Gary, or because I know that there'd be a lot more dialogue and questions and back and forth, but we have a tight agenda. But I cannot thank you enough. I think you gave us a lot to think about, and you were, it's sometimes when you get on these 3-4 hour meetings, you're like, all right, am I going to pay attention? But you really you caught my attention. So, and I am sure that seeing the chats, you caught the majority of the people. Pretty much everyone on here was very much engaged and present. So thank you for taking the time this morning. I greatly appreciate it.
Well, Patty and Laura do amazing work. And whenever I've been up to the area and asked to speak at events, I can see the passion they bring and how our participants and the folks in the room react and respond. I mean, true servant leadership. And so it's not hard to lead when you see people and meet people like Patty and Laura, who are just amazing leaders. So I want to thank them again for the opportunity and for Michael for his persistence.
Thank you again.